In his essay in the New York Times, When Heaven and Earth Come Closer, Eric Weiner shares his experiences of traveling to places such as Bondahas in Nepal, the Blue Mosque in Istanbul, and the island of Iona in Ireland. Eric refers to these places as thin places. It is, he writes, admittedly an odd term. One could be forgiven for thinking that thin places describe skinny nations, see Chile, or perhaps cities populated by thin people, see Los Angeles. No, thin places are much deeper than that. The concept of thin places arrives from ancient Celtic spirituality. There is a Celtic proverb that heaven and earth are only 3 feet apart, but in thin places they are even closer. Thin places are the places where the veil between this world and the other world or eternal world is thin. Old tales tell of people and beings of the other world being able to pass back and forth between worlds in these thin places. And so as Christianity moved into the Celtic areas, Christians adopted the idea of thin places to describe a particular spiritual experience. So what exactly makes a thin place? Weiner states, it's easier to say what a thin place is not. A thin place is not necessarily a tranquil place, or a fun place, or even a beautiful one, though it may be all these things too. Disney World is not a thin place, nor is Cancun. For in thin places, we become our most essential selves. As Weiner notes, it's easier to describe what thin places aren't than what they are. They may be locations that many people experience as being thin, such as the island of Iona. Or they may be highly personal, and you may be the only person who experiences them as this. And like Iona, they may be places that have been experienced as thin by many people over the centuries, or where that experience is fleeting, never to be repeated. Silence is often a component of thin places, but people also experience thin places through music and also in noisy places like airports. There is no one description of the required characteristics needed to make something a thin place. Great natural wonders such as the Grand Canyon may leave us amazed at God's work and wonder, but it may or may not be a thin place for us. Thin places are probably best understood by our sense of, yes, I know I am in one. I know what they are, from our experiencing them than from any attempt to define them. The Bible is full of stories about thin places. Moses on Mount Sinai, Isaiah in the temple, Peter, John, and James with Jesus on that mountaintop when Moses and Elijah appear. Though the term thin places never occurs in these stories, they share that sense of being in a place and time totally apart from the world, yet at the same time fully immersed within it. What differentiates a thin place from one where we may be awestruck is the sense of time, or rather the lack thereof. There is a sense that has been described by some as if time has collapsed. It's not just that feeling of being connected to history, of realizing that we are one of a long line of people who have come before us and who will come after us. There is a sense that one is with all these people at that very moment. Those that you've never met because they've come before you, and those you have yet to meet because they have yet to be in life. In that precise moment, you are so fully in the midst of God that it is deeper than just that feeling that we are in God's presence, but that you are immersed in time and the divine itself. Perhaps that's because, as theologian and biblical scholar Marcus Borg states, thin places are places where the veil momentarily lifts and we behold God, experience the one in whom we live, all around us and within us. Thin places are a means of grace. Writer and Episcopal priest Barbara Brown Taylor understands thin places in this way. As transparent places or moments, set apart by the quality of sunlight in them, or the shadows, or the silence, or the sounds. A thin place works to make you aware of that thin veil between apparent reality and deeper reality. It works to pull it aside just for a moment. But thin places aren't always lovely places. Hospital rooms can be thin places. So can emergency rooms and jail cells. A thin place is anywhere you're in the presence of the really real, the most real. And thin places sometimes aren't even places, but people. As Borg describes, Jesus in particular must have been a remarkable thin place. And the saints, known and unknown, Christian and unchristian, were and are thin places. On All Saints' Day, we remember not only those who have come before us, but celebrate all those people who have been and will be those thin places for us. It's a time we remember that those who surround us in that great cloud of witness are not only those who have already died, but those that we encounter today, those who are sitting beside you right now. The most unexpected person at the most unexpected moment may become that moment of grace that we truly experience the really real. Barbara Brown Taylor tells of one such saint that she met in the Clarksville post office. There was this red-headed child ahead of me, waiting for her grandmother to finish buying stamps. I could see she was bored, so I smiled at her. That made her bold enough to pick up my right hand and turn it over in both of hers, looking hard at all the dings and the freckles on both sides. "How'd you get that hurt?" she asked, touching an old puncture wound near my thumb. I told her I'd hurt it on a piece of chicken wire. Without saying another word, she leaned over and kissed the hurt place. Then she found another hurt place to kiss, and another. I thought I'd fall straight through that thin place. As I read the Beatitudes this week, I heard Jesus describing those thin places found within people. Those places where people are grieving and hurting in spirit are places of pain, but they're also places where sometimes we are most essentially ourselves. And that's when we may experience the presence of the really real as our masks and defenses are broken down. And because our masks and defenses are down and we are vulnerable, this may be the time that we are closest to God. But thin places are also found and carried in the people who follow Jesus. People who become the vessels through which we are transported, if only for a brief moment, to a place and a time where our hearts are open to all. For one brief moment, they become those vehicles of grace. Thin places are those saints who would be peacemakers, those who hunger and thirst for justice that goes beyond law and order to encompass all of God's children living in their God-given state. It encompasses those who work for righteousness that recognizes that we all are God's children and that within each and every person is that thin place that should be honored. They are the ones that recognize that the thin place that is in all of us, in all of God's children, where we are created not only to be a reflection of the divine, but a glimpse of it here on earth. That little girl in the post office with Barbara Taylor was blessed herself as she became that glimpse, that experience of God for Barbara. Perhaps the best explanation of thin places is captured within a story from the Hasidic tradition. It tells of a rabbi's son who on his way home from school would go wander out in the woods each day. So one day the rabbi asked his son, "I wonder, why do you walk in the woods each day?" The boy replied, "I go there to find God." The rabbi was pleased and replied, "That's very good, son. But don't you know that God is the same everywhere?" "Yes," the boy answered, "but I'm not." I invite you to embrace those thin places found within locations and time and people where you are not the same as you are everywhere else. To embrace and celebrate those who have come before us, those who will come after us, and those who journey with us today as part of that great cloud of witness that can reveal the really real, that is present everywhere and all time, but which is too often obscured by our worries, our fears, and even the ordinary details of living everyday life. And I invite you to embrace that you too are one of those thin places, one of those saints that we celebrate today. And celebrate those times when you are not the same as every day. When whether through a grand gesture or an ordinary act of kindness, the most real is evident in you. Today, we celebrate all the saints, and that includes each and every one of us. May you find and experience that thin place within you. Amen. In seminary, I took a trip to Turkey with many of my classmates and professors. And as we were there, traveling throughout the country and following Paul's footsteps, we had many of those thin places experiences. And some of them were in the expected spots, such as the Blue Mosque, Rumi's grave, the first place in Antioch where the Christians met. But the one for me that came was unexpected. It was in a place called St. Peter's Grotto. And tradition has it that this is the place that Peter, the disciple, started an early church in this cave where they hid and worshiped so that they could hide from the Roman Empire. Tradition says that, but observation and history and even those in the Antioch area will say that probably wasn't the case, because this cave is right on the side of a hill that you can see people coming and going from straight from town. Still, it was a place where early Christians did meet and worship. And so when I went there, I wasn't expecting much. I come from New England. I'm surrounded by historical sites. But as I stood there and as I touched the cold, damp wall of this cave and realized that for thousands of years, other Christians had come before me, other Christians would come after us and worship as we had that morning in the cave. I was brought to one of those thin places where they were with me. I was with them. And I experienced and knew not only the really real, but that I was really real. That I was one of God's children. So this coming week, I hope you don't have to travel to some place like Turkey, but that you find one of those thin places where you know you experience that really real and know that you are one of God's saints, one of God's beloved children. May God be with you until we meet again.